You won't believe what happened after the HOA decided to cut down my hedges, so I built a wall despite them. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. I had lived in my suburban home for years, and the hedges were the pride of my property. They had been carefully planted and trimmed, growing over time into a beautiful green barrier that provided privacy from the street and the neighboring houses. For me, the hedges weren't just a boundary. They were an oasis of tranquility, a space where I could relax in my backyard without feeling exposed to the prying eyes of passersby. I had always taken great care in maintaining them, trimming them seasonally and ensuring they were shaped perfectly. My neighbors would often compliment me on how lush and well-kept they looked. The hedges, in a way, had become a symbol of my commitment to maintaining a nice property and contributing to the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But all of that changed one afternoon when I got a visit from Karen. Now, I had seen her around before. She was the type of person who seemed to take it upon herself to monitor the neighborhood, always on the lookout for any minor infraction of the rules. I knew she was involved with the Homeowners Association, HOA, because she always had something to say about people's lawns, mailboxes, or fences. I had heard rumors about her, whispers from neighbors who had been on the receiving end of her helpful advice or, worse, her complaints. But I had never had direct contact with her until that day. It was a warm, sunny afternoon when I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, there stood Karen with a letter in her hand and that familiar, self-important look on her face. She handed me the letter, which, as I soon discovered, was a formal complaint from the HOA. The letter stated that my hedges were overgrown and violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. I was stunned. Overgrown? I had spent hours tending to those hedges, making sure they didn't exceed the height restrictions outlined in the HOA bylaws. But Karen wasn't here to discuss the nuances of those bylaws. She was here to enforce them. She explained, in her most patronizing tone, that the hedges needed to be trimmed down immediately, or else I would face significant fines and possible legal action. At first, I tried to reason with her. I explained that I had always kept the hedges in check and that they weren't obstructing anything. No driveways, no sidewalks, and certainly not the view of any neighboring homes. Karen, however, wasn't interested in hearing any of it. Her eyes had already glazed over as I spoke, and she began to rattle off a list of violations that were apparently causing an uproar in the HOA community. I could tell she wasn't listening to me, and I could feel my frustration rising. I tried to keep my cool, but it was difficult when she spoke to me like I was some sort of child who didn't know how to manage my own property. After Karen left, I immediately called the HOA office. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone there would have a shred of common sense and see the situation for what it was, an overzealous complaint from a woman who had nothing better to do with her time. But my hopes were dashed when I spoke to a representative who seemed to take Karen's side. The representative informed me that, according to the bylaws, my hedges did indeed violate the community standards. The rules stated that hedges couldn't exceed a certain height, and apparently, my hedges were a few inches too tall. I was taken aback. No one had ever mentioned this before, and I certainly hadn't noticed anything that could be considered a violation. I had never received any prior warnings, and yet here I was being told I needed to drastically trim back my hedges or face penalties. I spent the next few days seething with anger and disbelief. How could this be happening? Why was Karen so fixated on my hedges? It wasn't like I was doing anything out of the ordinary. Other houses in the neighborhood had hedges and fences that were just as tall, if not taller, than mine. I began to realize that this wasn't just about the hedges anymore. It was about control. Karen, and by extension the HOA, wanted to impose their vision of the perfect neighborhood on everyone, and my hedges were an easy target. Then, things escalated. One morning, a team of workers showed up at my house without any warning. They were from a landscaping company hired by the HOA to trim my hedges. I felt blindsided. I wasn't consulted about the workers coming, and there was no discussion about how or when the work would be done. The crew immediately set to work, wielding chainsaws and shears as if they had been given carte blanche to destroy anything in their path. I stood there, helpless, as I watched them butcher my beautiful hedges. They hacked away at the branches, cutting them down to nearly nothing. The once pristine boundary that had given me privacy and peace of mind was reduced to a sad, mangled pile of leaves and broken branches. I was furious. I had never authorized this, and yet the HOA had taken it upon themselves to send workers to my property to carry out their orders. I was left with a feeling of powerlessness. Not only had I lost something that was meaningful to me, but I also realized that this was about more than just the hedges. The HOA and Karen had crossed a line. They had infringed upon my rights as a homeowner and made me feel like I had no control over my own property. I spent the next week stewing over the situation. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just let Karen and the HOA get away with this overreach. I started to think about how I could take back control, not just of my hedges, but of my entire property. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed something permanent, something that would send a clear message that I wasn't going to be bullied into submission. I needed a structure that could stand the test of time and provide the privacy I had lost. That's when the idea hit me: a cinder block wall. A cinder block wall would be sturdy, permanent, and completely immune to the HOA's meddling. It wouldn't be something that could be trimmed or hacked away at by a crew of landscapers. It would be a strong barrier that would give me the privacy I desired and send a message to Karen and the HOA that I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. But I knew there would be challenges. Building a cinder block wall wasn't a simple task. It would require permits, tools, and a lot of work, not to mention the potential legal ramifications of defying the HOA's rules. Still, the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. This was my property, and I wasn't going to let anyone dictate what I could do with it. I made the decision to go ahead with the project. I would build the wall myself. I spent the next few days researching how to construct a cinder block wall, making sure I understood the steps involved and the necessary materials. I went to the local hardware store and bought everything I would need: cinder blocks, mortar, a trowel, and other supplies. The plan was set in motion, and I was ready to take back control of my property. After the HOA's brutal interference with my hedges, I had reached my breaking point. The cinder block wall idea was no longer just a passing thought. It became my mission, my way of reclaiming control over my property. I knew that I couldn't just sit back and accept the HOA's intrusion into my life. This was more than just about the hedges. It was about asserting my rights as a homeowner, about taking a stand against an association that felt it had the power to dictate how I should live on my own land. But constructing a cinder block wall was not going to be an easy task. It would require a significant amount of effort, resources, and planning. I had never built anything as ambitious as a wall before, so I spent hours researching how to do it properly. I looked up tutorials, read about building codes, and consulted with experts in online forums. I wanted to be sure that I wouldn't run into any major issues during the construction process. Most importantly, I needed to understand the local building regulations to avoid any potential legal trouble with the HOA or the city. I knew the HOA could be unforgiving, and I didn't want to give them any ammunition to use against me. After gathering all the information I needed, I made a list of the supplies I would require: cinder blocks, mortar, a trowel, a level, a shovel, and gravel for the foundation. The next step was to visit the local hardware store to purchase everything. It wasn't a small expense, but I didn't care. This was something I needed to do, and I was determined to see it through. I loaded up my truck with everything I would need, feeling a sense of excitement mixed with anxiety. This was it. I was about to embark on a project that would change the landscape of my yard forever. The first thing I had to do was prepare the area where the wall would be built. I spent several days clearing away the remnants of the damaged hedge and any other debris that had accumulated in that corner of the yard. The area had to be level and clear of any obstacles before I could begin laying the foundation. This part of the process was tedious, but I knew it was essential to make sure the wall had a solid, stable base. I used a shovel to dig a trench where the foundation would go. It needed to be deep enough to support the weight of the cinder blocks, so I made sure to follow the measurements I had learned from my research. Once the trench was ready, I filled it with gravel to help with drainage and stability. I used a level to make sure the gravel was evenly spread and packed down. This was the foundation of the wall, and it had to be perfect. After the gravel was in place, I began mixing the mortar. I had never mixed mortar before, but it wasn't as difficult as I had imagined. I followed the instructions carefully, using the right proportions of sand, cement, and water to create a thick, workable mixture. I applied the first layer of mortar to the trench, smoothing it out with my trowel, ensuring that it would provide a solid base for the first row of cinder blocks. Laying the first row of cinder blocks was both exciting and nerve-wracking. I had to be careful to ensure that the blocks were aligned properly and level. I took my time, checking and double-checking each block as I went. The process was slow at first, but with each block I laid, I gained more confidence. The wall was starting to take shape, and I could already envision how it would look once completed. There was something incredibly satisfying about physically building something with my own hands, especially after the frustration of dealing with the HOA's overreach. This wall was my declaration of independence, my personal statement that I would not be pushed around. As I continued laying the cinder blocks, I found that the process became more efficient. The mortar began to set, and the blocks started to stay in place without much adjustment. I carefully applied mortar to the top of each block before placing the next row, creating a strong bond between the blocks. The key to building a solid wall was to make sure the mortar was applied consistently and that the blocks were tightly interlocked. It was a labor-intensive process, but I was determined to finish what I had started. I worked late into the evening, determined to get as much done as possible before taking a break. During this time, I couldn't help but think about the HOA and Karen. I imagined her driving by and seeing the wall going up, her face contorting with rage at the sight of my defiance. I couldn't wait for the moment when she would realize that I wasn't going to back down. The thought of her frustration was incredibly motivating. After all, this wall wasn't just a physical structure. It was a symbol of my resistance against the HOA's tyranny. I wanted to make a statement that would resonate in the neighborhood. My property was mine, and I would not let anyone tell me what I could or couldn't do with it. As the wall began to rise, I realized that I was more than just building a physical barrier. I was building my confidence. Each cinder block I laid was a small victory, and each step brought me closer to completing my mission. The process was grueling, but it was also incredibly fulfilling. I felt a sense of pride in what I was doing. I wasn't just some passive homeowner at the mercy of the HOA. I was taking control of my property and my life. The satisfaction I felt as I worked on the wall was immense. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. But it wasn't just about the physical labor. There was also a mental and emotional aspect to this project. As I worked on the wall, I reflected on the power dynamics at play. Karen, the HOA, and all those who thought they could dictate my life were operating under the assumption that they had control. They didn't. I had the power to make decisions about my property, and I was using that power to create something that would stand for years to come. Every time I placed another block in place, I felt more empowered. The wall became a metaphor for my newfound strength and resilience. It took several weeks of hard work to finish the wall. There were days when I felt like giving up, especially when the weather didn't cooperate or when I encountered unexpected obstacles. But I kept pushing forward one cinder block at a time. Eventually, the wall was complete. It stood tall and strong, a permanent reminder of my defiance and determination. The contrast between the clean, sharp lines of the cinder block wall and the overgrown, hacked-up remains of the hedge was stark. I had successfully replaced the privacy I had lost and, in the process, built something that could not be taken away by a crew of landscapers or a self-righteous HOA member. The wall was more than just a physical structure. It was my victory. It sent a clear message to Karen, the HOA, and anyone else who might dare to challenge me. I had taken action, and I had won. The wall was a testament to my refusal to be controlled, a symbol of my independence and strength. When it was finished, I stood back and admired my work. It wasn't just a wall. It was my declaration of freedom. As soon as the cinder block wall was completed, I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. It was an imposing structure, sturdy and permanent, standing firm in the face of any opposition. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of my personal victory. It was no longer just a physical wall. It had become a symbol of defiance and resilience, a barrier against the intrusions of both the HOA and the broader societal expectation that we should conform to arbitrary rules. The wall was mine, and nothing could take it away from me. But as satisfying as the wall was, I knew there would be consequences. The HOA had already shown its ruthless side, and I had no doubt that Karen would soon find some reason to complain about my new construction. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the first official letter arrived in my mailbox. I tore it open with a mix of curiosity and dread, knowing full well that this would be the HOA's response to my rebellion. As expected, the letter was filled with legal jargon, threatening language, and the usual bureaucratic drivel that was designed to intimidate homeowners into submission. The HOA claimed that the cinder block wall was a violation of community guidelines. They argued that it wasn't the approved type of fence and that it exceeded the height restrictions outlined in the neighborhood's architectural guidelines. According to their interpretation of the rules, I had violated several clauses, and they demanded that I either remove the wall or face a fine. The letter also included the threat of legal action if I didn't comply within 30 days. The tone of the letter was condescending, as if they were certain I would cave under pressure, just like they had assumed I would when they came after my hedges. At first, I was angry, of course, but anger quickly turned to resolve. I had expected this. I knew the HOA would try to force me to tear down the wall, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. This wasn't about a wall. It was about standing up for my rights as a homeowner. The HOA had overstepped its bounds by dictating what I could do on my own property, and I wasn't going to back down now. I knew this battle would be far from over, but I was ready for whatever came next. I didn't respond immediately to the letter. Instead, I spent the next few days consulting with a lawyer to make sure I was fully aware of my legal rights. I wanted to understand the implications of my actions and ensure that I was legally protected. The lawyer explained that homeowners associations often overstep their authority, but that they could be powerful forces if they chose to pursue legal action. However, I was in the clear as long as I adhered to the local zoning laws and building codes. It was clear that my wall wasn't violating any of the legal codes, but the HOA was trying to enforce its own arbitrary rules. Armed with this knowledge, I felt more confident in my ability to fight back. After consulting with my lawyer, I decided it was time to respond to the HOA. I drafted a carefully worded letter, explaining that I had every right to build the wall on my property as it adhered to local building codes and zoning laws. I also made it clear that I was aware of my rights and was not going to be intimidated by the HOA's threats. I emphasized that the wall was a necessary measure to ensure my privacy, especially given the recent actions taken by the HOA to destroy my hedges. The tone of my letter was firm but respectful. I wasn't interested in escalating the situation, but I was also not going to let the HOA dictate what I could and couldn't do on my property. To my surprise, the HOA responded swiftly. A representative called me shortly after I sent the letter. The conversation was civil at first, but it quickly became clear that the representative was trying to pressure me into removing the wall. They argued that it was an eyesore and that it didn't fit with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. When I pointed out that the wall provided much-needed privacy, they quickly changed tactics and started threatening me with escalating fines. I remained calm throughout the conversation, knowing that I was in the right. I wasn't going to be bullied into backing down. The representative insisted that I attend an HOA meeting to discuss the issue further. I reluctantly agreed, knowing that the meeting would likely be my chance to put my case forward in front of the board. The day of the meeting arrived, and I showed up prepared with all the necessary documents to back up my position. I was ready to explain why I had built the wall and why it was a reasonable and legal addition to my property. The HOA board members, however, were clearly not interested in hearing my side of the story. They had already made up their minds that I had violated their rules, and they weren't going to back down. The meeting itself was frustrating. Karen, of course, was there, sitting smugly in the front row. The other board members nodded in agreement with her, as if she were some sort of expert on neighborhood standards. I was given a few minutes to speak, and I calmly laid out my reasoning. I explained that my wall was built in accordance with local zoning laws and that it wasn't an aesthetic issue. It was about my privacy and my right to make decisions about my own property. I even pointed out that other homes in the neighborhood had similar structures, and no one had complained about those. But as I spoke, I could see that my words were falling on deaf ears. The HOA had its agenda, and it wasn't interested in understanding why I had built the wall. It was interested in maintaining control over every homeowner's decisions. When I finished speaking, the board quickly dismissed my points, saying that the wall still violated HOA guidelines, regardless of its legal standing. They issued a final warning. I had 30 days to remove the wall or face a hefty fine, plus any additional legal fees if they pursued a lawsuit. They even mentioned that if I didn't comply, the HOA might take matters into their own hands and remove the wall themselves at my expense. The audacity of their threats was almost laughable. I wasn't about to let them get away with this. I left the meeting feeling more determined than ever to stand my ground. The HOA might have the power to impose fines, but they didn't have the power to control my actions or dictate my life. I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. Other homeowners in the neighborhood had been through similar battles with the HOA, and many had won. I wasn't going to be the exception. If the HOA wanted to take me to court, I was ready to fight. The following weeks were filled with tension. I continued to refuse to remove the wall, knowing that I was doing the right thing. Despite their threats, I refused to let the HOA intimidate me into submission. As the deadline passed, I expected the HOA to follow through with their threats, but to my surprise, they didn't take immediate action. It seemed that the HOA was hesitant to escalate the situation further, perhaps because they knew I was prepared to fight back. In the end, the HOA backed down. They never did take me to court, and the wall remained standing. It was a victory, not just for me, but for all the homeowners in the neighborhood who had felt powerless against the HOA's overreach. The experience had taught me an important lesson. When you stand firm and assert your rights, even the most powerful organizations can be forced to back down. The cinder block wall was no longer just a structure. It was a testament to the power of defiance and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. The HOA never fully accepted my wall, and Karen still gives me the occasional dirty look when she sees me in the neighborhood. But I know that I've won. The wall has become a permanent part of my home, a symbol of my resistance and my refusal to be controlled. The HOA can't take that away from me. My property is mine, and I will never let anyone make me feel like I don't have a right to live the way I choose.